for Rakuten Kobo, and I'm here to welcome you to the 2022 annual NICE Knowledge Exchange Speaker Spotlight, or Anki, featuring award-winning author Michelle Good in conversation with Michael Tamblyn, the CEO of Rakuten Kobo. Before we get going, just a few things to mention. Please visit nicenet.ca for more information about NICE and to sign up for the full conference, which will be held on May 26th from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and of course, featuring an amazing lineup of speakers. Rakuten Kobo is proud to support and sponsor the Anki and to ensure that everyone who would like to attend today is able to. We'll be digging into an important topic today, focusing on the experience of the Indigenous communities in Canada and what happened to children and parents during the residential school era. I'll now pass the mic over to Michelle and Michael. Please enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Renee. And I will. I'm going to pass the mic over to Michelle for a while. She's going to spend a bit of time speaking to you, and then I'm going to step back in, and we'll have a conversation afterwards. So take it away, Michelle.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll start by just talking a little bit about my background beyond writing this book, Five Little Indians, which seems to have been received quite wonderfully, and of course, which makes me very happy. I first started working with Indigenous organizations when I was 18 years old. And at that time, seeing the color of my hair, I can say that that was in the 70s. And at that time, virtually everybody that I was working with was a survivor of residential schools. And so in addition to the fact that my family, my mother, my aunties, my grandmother, all attended residential school, in addition to that, it really was sort of the framework of my life. The fabric of my life, my understanding of the world was deeply impacted by the residential school legacy in this country, both personally and in my work reality. And so it took me many years to get to this point, and in that of writing this book, of making the decision to sit down and actually write this book. And then prior to that, I worked for 25 years with Indigenous organizations, graduated law school at 43, was accepted into law school at 40. And people used to say to me, but you're going to be 43 when you graduate. And I would, thinking I was bonkers or something. And I would just say, well, I'll be 43 and a lawyer. And then I went into the Master of Fine Arts program at UBC and graduated from that when I was 56 years old, and got the same thing. You're going to be so old when you finish. And I have never really understood that, because, we're alive for as long as we're alive. And if we have things that we feel strongly about, things that we feel driven to accomplish, then should age be something that stands in the way of us doing that? And so during the course of my legal career, I represented many hundreds of residential school survivors, both in litigation and later through the alternative dispute resolution processes that were designed to make that process of settlement a little less onerous for survivors. And that experience was extremely frustrating. When I would be exposed to the kinds of responses from the churches and from the government and so on. But perhaps the one great impetus for writing this book was my fatigue, my emotional fatigue, if you will, at hearing this phrase repeated over and over and over. And that phrase being, why can't they just get over it? It's history. Why can't they just get over it? And so that was the impetus largely for writing this book, was to answer that question, why can't they just get over it? And to try through a fictional genre to develop characters that would be reflective of true survivors and their experiences, and would show how these traumas continue through a person's entire life. And so that's what I did. And it took me 9 years to write this book. And It was 9 years of a love-hate experience, joy and frustration, and all of the things that go along with writing a book, and never knowing while you're writing it if it's ever going to see the light of day at the end of the tunnel, so to speak. So that's kind of the background that led me to make the decision to write this book, and to hope that it would have um, the uh, reception that it has had. And nothing could make me happier than to see people embracing this book and embracing the real truth of residential school history, and using it as a launch point, if you will, for their own personal education on what this has meant for Indigenous people in Canada, and why there is such an intense focus on reconciliation, and why reconciliation is so critical. So, what I'd like to do today, before I have a chat with Michael, is just give you a little bit of background about how the residential schools came into being. I think this is extremely important to understand this context. I refer to the residential schools as one implement in the colonial toolkit. There were many, many other implements, but I'm going to talk about that just a little bit to give you this foundation, to give consideration to the impacts of residential school and why reconciliation is so critical. As I say, an implement in the colonial toolkit. And Google colonialism, Google colonialism, and you'll get about 5 million pages of, people doing work on colonialism, writing about it, and so on and so forth. And it can be very intense, and very complex. And so I just one day decided to go, well, what actually is the definition of colonialism? And so this is it. And it's so simple that I believe that it helps to understand, I guess, um, how this toolkit came to be and what its objectives were. So, the definition of colonialism is the policy of or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, and exploiting it economically. This is exactly what happened in what we now know as Canada. Is the French, the English, the Dutch early on came to Canada not so much with an idea of creating a lovely home for themselves, but it was perceived as a cash cow to be exploited for the imperial countries, so to speak. And when you think about colonialism around the world, its impacts include environmental degradation, the spread of disease, economic instability, rivalries between Indigenous nations, and human rights violations, and issues that long outlast the colonial rule. And that's what we see in Canada, is that the impacts of that colonial era are still felt, are still experienced in the country that we live in here. So I'm going to go a little ways back in history and talk about a couple of things that were also implements in that colonial toolkit. And when you think about the residential school endeavor, if you will, in the context of this larger picture, I believe that that's very helpful for for a much deeper understanding. So in the 1870s, the American government encouraged the slaughter of the buffalo as a strategy to conquer American Plains Indians. And it's important to understand that for Indigenous people, there is no difference between America and Canada. There were no borders, there were no imaginary lines until, they were set by, colonial governments, both in the US and Canada. General Sheridan stated, as I say, the buffalo slaughter was encouraged. Let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo are exterminated. Then your prairies can be covered with speckled cattle and the festive cowboy. Those are his words. I don't know what festive cowboy means, but I do know what it means to kill the buffalo, make room for the endeavor of non-Indigenous people. This recognition of the buffalo as the food, clothing, and shelter of Indigenous people was not lost on Canada. And approximately that similar policy was adopted by Canada, and approximately 4 million buffalo were exterminated on the Canadian plains. And Sir John A. Macdonald, of course, he came along later, but he described this or defined this as a policy, as part of a policy of submission based on a policy of starvation. In 1875, not too much further from that, we hear from Bishop Vital Grandin, who was a strong proponent, Catholic bishop, strong proponent of the residential school endeavor. And this was part of a discussion about making attendance at the schools mandatory, because they weren't in the beginning, it wasn't mandatory, it was ultimately decided to make them mandatory. And he made this comment in support of that. And what he said was, we instill in them a pronounced distaste for the native life, so that they will be humiliated when reminded of their origin. When they graduate from our institutions, the children have lost everything native except their blood. That, I'm sure, gives you a much better idea of the destructive intent of the residential schools. Not long after that, um, uh, in 1879, Nicholas Flood Davin, who was a bureaucrat and a bureaucrat and then a member of Parliament, was after the Department of Indian Affairs was established and the passage of the first Indian Act in 1876, the government began to focus in very intensely on the whole education question of Indigenous people. And at that time, Sir John A. Macdonald commissioned a study. He was the head of the Department of Indian Affairs then, commissioned a study of the American Indian boarding school, or industrial boarding schools that they called them. And Flood Davin then went to Pennsylvania to see the Carlisle School, which was considered a model school of this residential school slash boarding school structure. And he was very impressed with the relationship between the government and the church in having contractual arrangements where the government would fund the church to implement and to administer these schools. And strongly recommended when he came back that the same model be used in Canada, and that this could increase or actually decrease the cost, because they would negotiate that and would not have to be involved in the day-to-day administration of the schools. He reported back that in the United States, Indian education was used as a vehicle to force assimilation. And he was so impressed with the schools that he had seen in the US that he recommended that Canada proceed in a similar way. And in doing so, he quoted Richard Henry Pratt, who claimed, and this was the founder of the American system, who claimed that the Indian problem by education and assimilation could be resolved, it seemed, that through these boarding schools, as they were called, to be quite effective in deconstructing young Indians. Okay. Deconstructing young Indians. And we go back to Grandin, and they'll have nothing native left but their blood. Deconstructing young Indians, which I think helps us to understand that this was not a well-intentioned endeavor. This was something that was destructive in its origin. Prior to the residential schools being made, attendance at them being made mandatory, there were often day schools and boarding schools that were located right on the reserves. And during the debates to make attendance at the schools mandatory, Sir John A. Macdonald made this statement. He said, "When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with the parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly pressed on myself as the head of the department that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men." Nowhere in there do you see that they will acquire an education? What he says is they'll acquire the habits and modes of life of white men. They will be assimilated. And so in 1920, the attendance was made mandatory at these residential schools. But prior to that time, in 1907, there was the chief medical officer for the Department of Indian Affairs. His name was Peter Henderson Bryce, and he is my hero, one of my heroes. And he was given a task in response to overwhelming complaints from the parents of children that were at these schools, that they were dying at a rate that was exorbitant, that was just over the top. And so he was commissioned to do this study. And he came back and he stated in his report to Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the head of Indian Affairs at the time, that Indian boys and girls are dying like flies. Even war seldom shows as large a percentage of fatalities as the education system we have imposed on our Indian wards. And in fact, at one point he stated, if we had intended to create a system that would successfully communicate tuberculosis among the children, we've done it with the residential schools. And Scott responded to this by, first of all, firing Dr. Bryce, and later on stating that it is readily acknowledged that Indian children lose their natural resistance to illness habitating so closely in the residential schools, and that they die at a much higher rate than in their villages. But this alone does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared towards a final solution of our Indian problem. It is quite within the mark to say that 50% of the children who passed through these schools did not live to benefit from the education which they had received there. And so, even knowing that children were dying at a rate of sometimes 50% in these schools, it was not enough. Saving these children's lives or creating an environment that wouldn't kill them was a lower priority than assimilating them, than deconstructing them, so to speak. So then again, we have the attendance made mandatory in 1920. And on the occasion, Duncan Campbell Scott stated, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. I do not think, as a matter of fact, that the country ought to continuously protect a class of people who are able to stand alone. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department, and that is the whole object of the bill." And so we, rather than seeing a movement to make these institutions safer for these children, we just see a dogged determination to continue as they were with these deaths on this journey towards assimilation. Now, I used to think that the goal was in fact assimilation, and actually until quite recently, I used to think of the goal of these schools as being assimilation. And I think my attitude about that changed while I was working on the book. And I started writing about these kids. I knew so many kids like these kids, you know, and I started thinking about these kids coming out of the schools with no support, with no training, with no options, with no money, no place to go in many cases. And I began thinking about that question of, is this assimilation? And I decided that while assimilation was a part of the goal, really this was a genocide. And you know, after the second, or during the Second World War and the discovery of the Jewish Holocaust, Winston Churchill said that it was a crime without a name, that they couldn't name this crime. It was so horrendous. And ultimately, Raphael Lemkin who was involved in developing the genocide conventions at what is now the United Nations, developed a definition or developed the word, came up with the word genocide, which is basically um, the destruction of a people, either a national group, an ethnic group, and so on, religious group. And there are five, um, and these have been expanded over the years, but basically in the conventions, there are five ways that genocide is implemented. I won't go through all five, but one of them is the transfer of children from one group to another. And of course, that's exactly what happened here, is the removal of children from their Indigenous communities, structures, cultures, spirituality, and the placement of them in institutions determined to deconstruct them. And then, of course, we have all of the abuses that occurred during the course of the child's attendance at the school. And many people think about intergenerational trauma. I mean, the child themselves is traumatized from the moment they're taken from their family. Their family, under threat of incarceration and monetary fines, not permitted to resist to keep them home. So their first traumatic experience is they're little wee kids, 5 and 6 years old, sometimes even younger, who are taken from their parents, and their first thing that they learn is that their parents, who we look to when we're little wee kids for safety and protection, are powerless, that they are not safe anywhere. That's the first trauma. But people tend to think of intergenerational trauma as something that starts with the person that went to the school, where they experience trauma, their children then experience intergenerational trauma, and so on. But I don't see it that way. I see it as a far more circular thing as opposed to a linear thing, because the day that first child is taken to residential school, their grandparents are traumatized. Their parents are traumatized. Their relations in the community are traumatized, because the entire social structure is, the entire social fabric, I mean, is being unwoven by taking the children away from their experience, which would have been education through their parents, through their elders, through their community, about how to take their natural role, their natural place in the Indigenous community. So I see that intergenerational trauma as being far more circular, and actually beginning with the grandparents as well as the little children and the subsequent generations. But and then, of course, intergenerational trauma, I often describe it as having, as being like radiation. It has a half-life. It's something that continues and continues. And I've recently been reading that there is actually, um, evidence that there is a genetic component in the transference of trauma from one generation to another. So I wrote this book, and I hoped, as I said earlier, that it would be a launching off point for people to question what they think they know, and to perhaps engage in a course of self-education. When I first started researching all of this stuff, it was in the dusty archives and the libraries and, all of those kinds of things. Not anymore. These things are so easily accessible online. They're very easy to access, and also um, um, many museums and archives are also online as well, so that you can actually search documents online, and it's made learning about these things a much easier thing to do. I am very pleased to be here today, and with that, I'm going to ask Michael to join me again, and we'll go into the next part of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And thank you for taking the time to give us that background and to be a piece of our own ongoing education. Far more engaging than any webpage that we could ever dig up online. I want to pick up on a couple of the threads that you were talking about earlier. The characters in Five Little Indians are residential school survivors. They are launched or ejected into the world with no skills to speak of. They're living at a time when mental health isn't a part of their regular discourse. In your early career, you were an activist working with Indigenous organizations, later working as a lawyer. Your mother went to residential school. You had a lot of people around you who did. When did you first start to write down people's stories or to capture their experiences as, and we'll kind of sketch that line farther forward.
Yeah. Well, I started writing poetry. My mom didn't really talk about it. And what was really interesting about that is you'll hear that a lot from survivors, or children of survivors. My parents, my grandparents never talked about it. Well, that's really understandable to me. Why would you want to? Why would you want to revisit some of the most horrible times of your lives? But what my mom, it's so funny how you absorb information, right? Because my mom used to say she went to boarding school. Okay. And so I grew up in a non-Indigenous community because my mother married a non-Indigenous man, and so at that time you lost your status and you had no access to your community officially. So I grew up far away from our territory. I grew up in a non-Indigenous community, was an avid reader, and I'm reading things like Nancy Drew and all of those kinds of things as a kid, right? And so boarding school meant something to me in that context. It meant like something in Switzerland or France or La Chita, right? And so, I had, my mom went to boarding school. Right? And then one day she told me the story of Lily. And the story of Lily is included, the facts are changed, but the truth of her death um, by way of hemorrhaging from tuberculosis is true. And I don't know why my mother chose to tell me that story. I was about 11. And she was there with her friend Lily as she hemorrhaged to death on the playground. And so I was a very little girl when I started. Well, it really threw me in a state of cognitive dissonance. It was like, oh my God. But it started then. And I wouldn't say that I started writing about it until in the 90s, I started writing poetry about those stories my mom told me, and about the whole way that it impacted me and made me feel, and just trying to grasp the whole concept of it all. And until I started writing the book, I never really wrote about it. It's like it's almost like I had a residential school corner of my brain, if you will, and the stories and the truths and the learning that I was doing about it was sort of stored there. Maybe that's why I had to write the book. My brain was too full. But yeah. And then when I did the Masters of Fine Arts, I did it specifically to write this book, so that I would have obligations to my student colleagues and professors to produce writing, and would have to fit it into my already overloaded schedule. And so, yeah.
So you mentioned Lily, one of the characters from the book. Are the five characters of Five Little Indians, are they composites of survivors you encountered, or archetypes or examples? How did those characters come together for you?
I would say that they're more like archetypes, right? In the sense that, what I learned through the course of my life was, so far, was what happened to these children and what the impacts of it were on them, subsequent to their attendance and also while they were there. And so when I first started writing the book, the first character I started writing was Kenny. And right away, it was just a writing exercise we were given. And right away, I knew I need more characters because I understood the depth and the breadth of the harm and the injuries and the abuses. And one character couldn't possibly carry that entire weight, not at all. And so, that was when I started thinking of it sort of as archetypes, where this character would carry this load, this character would carry this, and so on. So, yeah.
Mhm. people talk about your career as this wonder of achievements that happen beyond your 40s, as if you were like hiding somewhere and then jumped out from behind some bushes and suddenly became a lawyer at 43. Um, but you tell me, what led up to that transition from first from activism to law school? What did you want to accomplish in making that change?
Mhm. Well, I was a little kid when I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. My own life was interrupted by being scooped in the 60s scoop and was in foster care for 5 years. Um, and I conflated law with justice in my, adolescent mind.
Mhm.
I've learned since quite differently. And I just got to an age where I thought, if I'm going to do this, I better do it now. And so I did. But again, I say it's because I did conflate law with justice. I had this drive to, and as I was doing law, I was absolutely certain I would practice in the area of Aboriginal law, and and that's what I did. So yeah, so I guess what it was is this is my life. I've always wanted to do this. I'm going to do it, and I have a very strong belief that regardless of your age, if you have things that you want to do, then do them. Because there's one thing that's common to all of us, and that is we're going to die. And so I've said to people over the years, I live for my deathbed, right? That when on that day, should I be conscious and I'm moving on to whatever is next, I want to look back and say, I did my best to do the things that I felt were meaningful and important to me. We only have this one life on earth. And, so I want to live till the last second that I'm breathing. So,
Now, I'm married to a lawyer who comes from a family of lawyers,
mm,
friends who are lawyers, and I'm, as a result, often surrounded by lawyers. And usually, when people say they're surrounded by lawyers, something bad is happening.
that's
But in my case, it's probably
true.
Thanksgiving dinner. One thing they all say is that law school is about changing your brain, or if not changing it, then training you to a certain way of looking at and approaching facts and how they're organized. Does that resonate with you? Is that a
Oh yeah. And
yeah, okay.
I was a fully formed human when I went to law school, so it was a fight.
Well, that's kind of what I wanted to know, because is it different than the experience that someone at 24 would have had going through that? And there are probably 35 people on this call thinking about neuroplasticity right now, so you have to feed them something.
Absolutely. I really do feel that it would have been an entirely different experience. I mean, really, when you look at a young person that has graduated from high school, let's say at 17, they do an undergrad degree, they're 21. Okay. They're 21 years old. Okay. Your brain is so untested, so to speak. It is still such a blank slate. It's still such tabula rasa, right? Um, that it is fertile ground for creating the legal machines, which is really what I think is the purpose of law school. Is shape your brain, take your beautiful round brain and make it square, right? So that you can work within. Like I say, I always thought law was about justice, right? And I'm from Red Pheasant, as some people know, the Red Pheasant Cree Nation, and that's the nation where Colton Boushie was murdered. Um, and Colton is my relative. And I sat in a few meetings with the family and the Crown and the RCMP and so on. And the family was so distressed. And I said about the process, and I said to them, look, law is not about justice. Sometimes justice is a byproduct of the law, but the law is really about social control. It's about rules and consequences for breaking the rules. That's it. Justice is a much higher principle. And so when you think of it in that way, that's what law school is teaching people how to function within the details, the fine minutia of those rules and how the rules work.
And and so you're then in legal practice, you're focusing on Indigenous issues, and as you say, hundreds of files moving across across your desk over time. So when does the idea first hatch? You know what I should do? I need to write a book because I'm not able to. Is it I have things that need to be said that I'm not able to say through the work that I'm doing right now, or there was a different message that you were trying to get across than what you could with the law.
Well, yeah. And I mean, I was threatening it for years, right? Years and years of while I was practicing. I'm going to write a book. And, it's really because, you know, all the law does. I mean, these are personal injury cases to the law. Okay. They're not genocide cases. They're not, cases about cultural loss. They're not about intergenerational harm. They're not about those things that are really the true impacts of these, of that legacy. It's about causation. It's about all of those things, and a big scrap about who gets, who can prove causation, who can, and it doesn't tell the heart of the story. And so, yeah, so it was, I mean, I always wanted to write. That was the same thing as always wanting to be a lawyer, is I always wanted to write. But it was during the time that I was practicing that I thought, this isn't telling the story. And I need to tell this story. I just need to tell it. Yeah.
Well, and especially with arguments in law being about the emotion stripped out. It's supposed to be just facts, and so much of this is about those deeper harms, those harms that are rooted in emotion, that are rooted in the self. People make a big deal about the age at which you started working on this book, and the age where the book was first published. We have a whole virtual room full of people here who spent all of their time thinking about how to make sure that people live long, interesting lives, and even they think it's interesting. So let's talk about that a bit. There is this perception that it's hard to start new things as you get older, to change tracks, to change direction. And was there internal resistance that you had to push through when you decided, okay, law, great, now book?
You mean in terms of my own process, in terms of,
or just like, am I written?
Or, no.
Excellent.
It's like I say, we are alive until we stop breathing. And that there's no difference between that. I mean, there are obviously differences between being 20 and being 60, right? But you're alive, and you have, and I think that one of the reasons that this book has been as successful is that I didn't bring a 20-year-old's experience to this book. I brought a 60-year-old's experience to this book. But what you say about it being a big deal, it's like, what the heck? And I just, I was so glad that I'm not a person that is sensitive about, I don't hide my age or any of those kinds of things. And, there was a Toronto Star attitude or article saying that, debut novelist at 64. It's like, and that's the headline. Okay. That's the headline, is that I did this when I was 64, as though that's, some kind of remarkable achievement, which it isn't. It's, I mean, yeah.
It's the time that the book needed to happen.
Well, and I really do think that's the case. It took a long time to write this book because, you don't embark on something like this lightly, but it landed, it couldn't have landed in a better moment in time, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah.
Writing any book is difficult, but you also had to write while mourning the death of your son, Jay, who died in 2013. You were extremely close. If you don't mind my asking, how does work continue through grief like that?
Well, he held me accountable after he died. I knew that he would be, and I fully believe in afterlife, in the context of my Indigenous spirituality. And I knew that he would just be so bitterly disappointed if I didn't follow through, if I didn't finish. And so he helped me in that way. And I'm sure that, one of the reasons it took as long as it did is that, those early days following grief, following his death, are, of course, a struggle to get out of bed, much less write a book. Um, but he motivated me. And, I think maybe I'll tell you the story about the cover of the book. How about that?
Please.
So this is the advanced reading copy that I use. It's not the final physical copy of the book, but when they were and like the publisher has control over what the cover will be because it's considered a part of marketing. And they sent me this draft cover, and it was just awful. It was just the most kind of cover that you could imagine. And I said, look, I want the cover to reflect the gravitas of what's between the covers. And then they sent me this, and I literally gasped. I was breathless when I saw this. And the reason for that is because when my son died, he died on the full moon, and it was the pink moon that he died. And it was, to me, that was a message from the heavens that he's in this with me, that he's there pulling strings and making things happen in such a phenomenal way. And, so that was a real encouragement to me as well. But I just couldn't let him down. I couldn't let him down. No.
This book was a 9-year project for you, as you said. My understanding is that when you first started writing, you thought about writing a work of nonfiction. And so what made you decide that fiction gave you the right tools for this story?
When I actually went to the MFA, I was already beyond the nonfiction stuff.
Okay.
I decided at that point that it was going to be fiction. But what was the deciding factor? Because I could write, a big treatise about the whole thing and the history and all that kind of stuff, right? What really made my mind up to go with fiction is that fiction gives you a broader latitude. Your facts, even though this book is, even though fictional, is factual, okay? It's true, even though it's not factual, if you will. And this gave me the leeway that I could include all of those realities of the abuse of children, the ongoing trauma, all of those kinds of things. I could assign those things to characters. I wouldn't be tied to, well, this happened, this didn't happen, to somebody's chronology, so to speak. I could just create the chronology from the knowledge that I had. And I also felt, okay, so that was more technical. But I also felt that it was a safe place. Anybody could pick up this book and say, it's just fiction. It's just fiction. Until you get into it and it gets its claws into you. And then
Fiction's sneaky that way.
That's right. And then you realize that something need not be factual in order to be true. And I think that's one of the strengths of this book, is that it's been able to do that. So that decision came quite early in the process. Yeah.
Now, I still have lots more questions, and I'm going to keep asking them, but I also want to remind people that you can ask your own questions. You can share them in the chat, and they'll be picked up by our fantastic Nice Network team and passed through to us. So as things are coming up, don't hesitate to drop them in the comments, and then I'll pass them on to Michelle. But while we're waiting for those to come through, you and I have been on camera once before, and I would like you to share your recollection of that particular moment, if you will.
Oh gosh, it was, I think I referred to it as a beautiful ambush, right? Because of course I very surprised. I'm completely surprised by awards. I am. The book just recently won Canada Reads, and again, nobody is more surprised than me. Um, but I was shortlisted for the Kobo Rakuten Emerging Writer Award, and we had this interview to discuss all of that, and then I'm told you won. It was just like, take my breath away. It was it was wonderful, of course, but it's a strange experience.
Um, yeah, so we ambushed her a little bit because we wanted to get that perfect moment when you go from, hey, maybe I could win, to I've actually won. We captured it on film. It was fantastic. But that was near the beginning of the extraordinary reception that
Yeah.
Five Little Indians received. We were part of, I think, 1 week where you won the Kobo Emerging Writers Prize, the Amazon First Novel Prize, and I think the Governor General's Prize
Yes,
for Fiction.
yes, yes.
Did you have any sense that the book would resonate so strongly that it would find such an audience?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And it was actually something I didn't think about. When you're writing your first book, you're not thinking even about it being published, right? You're thinking about writing the book. And but as it got, ready for submissions and whatever, I started thinking about that. And I really felt that this would be a niche book for a niche audience. And nothing could be further from how it's actually played out. It's it's been astonishing. It really has.
Uh,
Oh,
you're now working on a new book, and all that I know is that it is historical. It goes back to the late 19th century, and it isn't done yet. So, what, if anything, can you tell us about it?
sure. I'm actually working on two books right now. One is a collection of essays because I want to tell history um, in story form. Like it's not, they're not academic essays. They're like opinion essays, but they're not
Mhm.
opinion. They're grounded in fact. And they're more a read between the lines. Like I'm reading between the lines and telling you how this resonates. So that I have a deadline of September. So yeah, so that's coming along. And then I'm also working on another novel, another historical fiction novel, again, focusing on the clearing of the plains, so to speak. Yeah.
So you had 9 years for the first one. How is this one going?
Oh, they're going good. I mean, it's a very different experience to write after you've been published, and especially after um, writing a book that has this kind of reception. It's like, I have readers. They're going to be having expectations. It's a little daunting, but I have a good structure for the novel in place, and it's really percolating here, and the essays are coming along. So, in the next year or two, there should be a couple of books out.
Mhm. The last residential school closed, I believe, in 1996. So there are countless living survivors who have experienced that match the characters in the book.
Mhm.
Those survivors are also getting older. Now, how do you feel that truth and reconciliation changes as the survivors age in time?
Well, I don't think it changes. I don't think that reconciliation should be different for immediate direct survivors as it is for intergenerational survivors, because, and this is why I always try to place this reality deeply in the context of colonialism, because all of those initiatives, the intent that was behind all of the colonial initiatives, are the foundation of our social structures, our governing structures, policing structures, education structures, the whole thing. They all reflect, whether we know it or not, those colonial objectives. And we see some of that changing significantly. Um, but the reason that reconciliation fails, and it is failing at this point, is the failure to understand that it requires, first of all, the whole truth, the whole truth. and I like to call it the unlaundered truth. And secondly, it requires substantive change, not just, procedural or policy change. It requires structural, substantive change. And until that happens, this is just going to keep circling and cycling along and be traumatic in its own way. So.
A, a comment from one of our audience members was that he thought that the character Kenny and his mother appeared to be an example of that circular nature of trauma, and that circular intergenerational nature of trauma. Does that ring true for you?
Yes. And, that was one thing that I really wanted to articulate through the book was, how the parents suffered so deeply, so deeply. And, in that, with that character, with Kenny going home and that kind of trouble, I think it does express that. But there's another character as well who tries to go home and it doesn't work. And that's Mariah, or not Mariah, sorry, that's Maisie. And she goes home and she lasts a month. And it's because those relationships have been so fundamentally altered and destroyed, and that bond has been broken. And so then you have these generations upon generations of children that have no place of belonging.
You've talked about how little support there is for survivors of residential schools in Canada and how difficult it is for people to be able to heal either themselves or their communities. If we made better decisions, if we had different priorities, what do you imagine that healing could look like?
Well, I feel that, as I was saying earlier, it has to be like this systemic change. And, we tend to look at these, and this is again why I talk about it just being one implement in the colonial toolkit. The whole thing has to be fixed. And to me, that comes from a recognition of our right to self-determination as Indigenous people. And that I'm going to give you an example. Rupert's Land. Okay. Rupert's Land is the Hudson's Bay, or was the Hudson Bay watershed. And in 16 something or other, King Charles II gave Rupert's Land to the Hudson's Bay Company. In 1869, Canada bought, in its colonial form, bought the Rupert's Land for $1.5 million. Okay. Indigenous people got none of that, right? They got no compensation either from the Bay or from the government when the purchase was made. $1.5 million. I feel like that guy. $1 million. $1.5 million in today's dollars is $31,700,000. Okay. Now that's just one transaction of land theft, and how that land theft was used to generate wealth and used to generate an economy. Okay. And how it was no benefit, none whatsoever, inured to Indigenous people. It was all towards the colonial society. And, so recently the old Hudson's Bay store in Winnipeg, they gave it to Indigenous people. My response to that is it should have come with $31 million, right? But if you think about that right across the country, okay, with the land theft, and, in October 7th, which is my birthday, 1763, King George III uttered a royal proclamation recognizing that Indigenous people could not be removed from their lands unless they ceded or sold the lands. So that's recognized to this, that has legal force to this day. But ask the Wet'suwet'en, whose land is understood to be unceded, if that is reflected in the ongoing battles over the proposed pipeline or the construction of the pipeline. And so our economy was wiped out, right? So that, this new European-based economy this colonial economy could take place or could develop in Canada. But there's never been any recognition that non-Indigenous Canadians of today continue to benefit from those actions, and that we continue to be marginalized and impoverished. And we need to be able, this has to be a part of reconciliation. There has to be an economic component that will, so that we get out of the welfare reality. We get out of the here's a few pennies from the feds, right?
Mhm.
And get to a point where we can regenerate our own economies, regenerate our own resources. When we have that self-determination, we can also regenerate our traditions and our ways of healing. It has to be the whole thing.
Mhm. There was a passage, and I encourage people to continue sending your questions in, and I'll pass them. We'll even flash them up on the screen. They look really nice there. There was a passage that just struck me hard in the book. Lucy's talking to another character. The passage goes: Lucy leaned back in her chair, hands folded on her lap. They call us survivors. Yeah. I don't think I survived. Do you? I was wondering if you could expand a bit on that for me.
Yeah. The little kids, and it's interesting because there is a juxtaposition. Okay. The little kids that went into the school, could we say that they were the same people that came out of the school? Who could no longer, my mom, okay, she continued to be fluent in her language her entire life, because she didn't speak English at all when she went to school, and she was 9. She was 9 when she went. And there were some schools, and I knew about this personally, where needles were stuck in the tongues of children that spoke their own language. They were certainly physically punished for speaking their own language. So if you come out of school, and there's an example with Lucy, or not, sorry, Lucy, with Clara, when she's having all these fearful responses to the sweat lodge and to cultural and spiritual indigeneity, and she hears Sister Mary in her head, devil worship, devil worship. So could we really expect that those children are the same children that walked out of the school? That went in, they're not the same when they come out. Couldn't possibly be. Um, and it's so sad. It's so, so sad. And, in my own experience with foster care, I was the only kid that was scooped from my family. And let me tell you, my worldview is entirely different than my siblings. Okay. And
And for people who aren't familiar with that moment in time, can you talk a bit about the scoop in the 1960s?
sure. In 1969, the residential school started winding down. And, don't be fooled. It wasn't because, the government had a change of heart and thought, oh no, we can't do this anymore. It was because the employees at the school wanted to be considered federal employees with all of the benefits, including pensions and, all that kind of stuff. And so the Fed said, oh, no, 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 that's going to be all too costly. And so what happened then, as the schools started closing down, the child welfare system picked up that role. And we also have that experience in the book where, we have the birth alert with Lucy when she has her baby, and the social worker comes and they're going to, apprehend the child, and so on and so forth. And so, just a huge number of children were taken, just as they were taken for residential school, and either adopted to non-Indigenous families or put into the foster care system. And that continues to this day.
The room that we're talking to thinks a lot about elders through a lot of different lenses. Do you get to be an elder yet? When does that happen for you?
That's really funny because people always want to call me an elder, right? And elder to me has a very different meaning than, and my response to that is I'm an older, not an elder. And the reason for that is because an elder is a wise person. An elder, like we think about the elders of the church, that kind of thing. An elder is a person who through their life has become richly wise. And I would never say that about myself. But yeah, and so there isn't kind of, 65, you're an elder. It's not like that. It's a whole different thing.
A question came through from someone who's watching, who said, "I'm not sure what to ask, but I research and work in the field of spirituality and aging, and was wondering if you could speak on that topic from your perspective."
Mm. Well, my spirituality started taking form when I was a teenager, and I began learning about my traditional spirituality and traditional beliefs and the cultural context for that. And I think, oh well, I don't think, I know that has steeped and deepened as I become older, and it creates a place of comfort for me in my life when I see the horrors of things continuing and the ongoing impact on our people. It's my spirituality that is um, my teddy bear, if you will, my source of comfort in life, my place to go to rest, repair, and continue. I think spirituality is a critical part of our being, and that people need to find room in their life for that, whatever it is that they choose to believe.
Mhm. Canadian society, North American society, settler society, there's a tendency to listen less to people who are older. Um, how the
Oh, jeez.
and this is again, we have a group of people who are active here in both trying to counteract that and to create more space uh, for older voices and older adults. As you're looking at both the society that you come from, your own personal experience, the people who've been influential to you, what advice do you give to the people on this call about creating more space for that, of creating more room for those voices to come through?
Well, I feel very strongly that the current role or the current limitations, if you will, or I don't know if that's the right word, but I'll find my way. Um, the way that we perceive older people in this society, I really believe is linked to how we define human value. And human value in this society is based on your production as it relates to economy. You retire at 65, you're not relevant anymore because you're not, supposedly you're not, contributing to the economy. And it's this obsession with economy as being the foundation of society. And so, and I mean, the first time that my mom told me once, she said, getting old is for the birds. she said, she said, people treat you like you're invisible. And that I experienced that when I was in the Masters of Fine Arts program with my thesis supervisor who kept, sort of talking through me instead of engaging, as he would with, a younger person. And I think probably the most important thing that people can do is to think of people, regardless of their age, beyond their economic value, right?
Mhm.
Think of them in the context of their experiences and how you've got a whole lifetime of experiences to share with people and to help educate people. And, I think that's what I have to say about that.
A question came from one of our viewers who said, "I've been following the CBC's Beyond 94 website about the progress of the 94 Truth and Reconciliation Commission action items. Uh, what is your take on that website?" And I'd add on, are there other resources that you direct people to as they're trying to know more about truth and reconciliation?
Well, I've been educated today because I wasn't even aware of that website.
There you go.
Oh, there you
Thank
go.
you, Rob.
Yes, thanks, Rob. I appreciate it. But one site that I really like a lot is there's a place called the Yellowhead Institute, and it is an Indigenous think tank, if you will. And if you just Google Yellowhead Institute, it'll take you there. And they did an incredible piece. I've lost track of time, a year and a half ago, maybe, about the progress of the Truth and Reconciliation of the 94 calls to action. And what's so clear in their analysis of it is that it's only the very superficial calls to action, not the systemic calls to action, but the ones that deal with sort of one-offs that have been addressed, because people are not yet prepared to accept that it's a structural change that is needed for meaningful reconciliation. But yeah, there were things like, funding the arts. There were things like, you know, just all those one-off things, funding the missing and murdered women, Indigenous Women Tribunal, that public inquiry. And I mean, I'm not saying it's not important. I'm just saying these are one-off things that are easily accomplished and don't require a depth of analysis. They don't require a change in systems. They don't require any of that. They really just require, here's some money. And that isn't going to solve the issues. It's really not.
But
So I'm going
in
to
doing that can do in doing that can do some of the work of restitching and reconnecting culture,
Yeah.
strengthening bonds and communities. It doesn't, as much as the whole thing needs to be changed, it's not like if you're unwilling to change the whole thing, there aren't still a lot of things that can be done.
That's right.
I'm offering last call for questions before we wrap it up, because we've had a wonderful conversation. You also provided us with a reading list,
Yeah.
and they did a great job of tidying it up for us and making it look beautiful. Can you talk to us a little bit about the books that are on this list for people that are interested?
Sure. The first book, A National Crime by John S. Malloy, he worked on with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He's an historian, and he wrote this book about, and it's basically the entire history of residential schools. And the title comes from, this is another book that is really, it's just a little teeny thing, and it's the story of a national crime. And this is by Dr. Peter Bryce, who I referred to earlier. This is his report about, or his response to what he found when he reviewed the residential schools and found that incredible death rate. So both of those are really good. Clearing the Plains by James Dashak started out as his PhD dissertation. And what it is the history of clearing the plains. It's about the colonial period in what was the Northwest Territories, which is actually now the prairies, if you will. And it is an incredible history. It is one of the best histories I have ever read. It's deep history. It's not just chronology. It's very good. A Narrow Vision is an excellent book. It focuses on Duncan Campbell Scott and how he impacted policy as it pertains to Indigenous people. Residential Schools and Reconciliation by J.R. Miller is, another good sort of contemporary analysis of, where things are at. This one I love, Seeing Red, History of Natives in Canadian Newspapers. This is very interesting because it does an analysis of, in effect, a partnership between government and media, and how media has, over the decades, generations, hundreds of years, been more like a curriculum, right? The way choices are made about what is covered in the media is about upholding a certain perception, a certain way of being in the world, as opposed to simply being, facts and the truth of things that are going on. So those are some really good starting places, for self-education on these subjects, and so I like to recommend them as much as possible.
And you mentioned earlier that in your new books you're doing a fair amount of research. Are you a joyful researcher or a reluctant researcher as you head to the libraries?
I'm a furious researcher.
And with good reason.
I mean, furious in the sense of just going. I actually really love research. And it's almost like creating a map, right? In the sense that you read, you learn, you chart it out, and it all becomes the raw material for your work. And I just love it a lot. Yeah.
Mhm. Um, I think unless there are no other questions coming in at the last minute, I want to thank you for such a wonderful conversation and for an incredible book. We can't wait for the ones that come next, not just as a bookseller but as a reader. And any last parting thoughts before I pass it back to Renee?
Well, I would just like to say thank you for inviting me to be here today. I appreciate the opportunity. And, you know, as we move into our third act, so to speak, in terms of our age, we are rich people. We are rich individuals with our life experiences. And the fact that we're turning a certain age shouldn't stop us from sharing, developing, growing until the last minute. This is not a dress rehearsal. This is our life.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I will pass it back to Renee.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. And Michelle, I learned something new from you every time I hear you speak. The story about the cover really got to me. Very powerful. So thank you to you, thank you, Michael, and thank you to all our guests for joining today. And just one last reminder: for more information about the conference or NiceNet in general, please visit nicenet.ca. And have a great rest of the day, everyone.
Thank you. Have a lovely
Bye.
day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.